Welcome to INFINTECH, where decision makers connect. INFINTECH is organized by Logate, your painless vendor for digital journey, in partnership with MasterCard, empowering connections, shaping tomorrow.
So alongside everybody else, I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. Just briefly, following on from the sessions we've just had, I'm going to cover the kind of fraud threats and the view that we need from a 360 perspective of our customer journey. So we talked about onboarding and digital transformation and account management, etc. So I'm going to cover some of those aspects. I am going to cover aspects from the LexisNexis point of view, and I'll focus on our fraud prevention point of view. We provide fraud prevention services to thousands of customers worldwide, but that allows us insight into actually what's happening in terms of fraud threats, attacks, and risks within the industry. So just to highlight that, we've been talking about the risks for onboarding and the kind of the elements that are there. I just want to highlight in the digital space that we see across all types of industries, so finance, healthcare, insurance, gaming, telecoms, e-commerce, on average, 1 in 11 new accounts that are created digitally are attempted fraud. So if you're adding 100 accounts today, 11 of those are attempted fraud. That is a huge concern for those that are launching and fast-tracking digital services. That's accounting to millions and billions of attacks annually across all types of services. But it also accounts in terms of the highest fraud loss is on that onboarding journey. If you're providing an e-commerce service, you're providing digital services, you're providing loans, credit facilities, etc., your initial loss is onboarding that bad customer. But what we tend to do is we tend to focus on the end of the customer journey, and I'll come back to that kind of later. The other side now is the shift to how they are targeting fraud. They are targeting our end consumers rather than our network infrastructure. And as such, account takeover and account manipulation is also a problem. So if we are launching digital self-service, digital apps and interaction to give the customer that fast, easy, one-click experience, it also means we give the fraudster that easy, simple, one-click experience to get access to the data they need. And we see that in terms of account takeover manipulation and account takeover growth within the industry. So looking at certain kind of facilities, every digital journey needs a password reset process because we tend to rely on username and password as our kind of login facilitator. 1 in 9 password resets are attempted fraudulent access. So, and we see that again across all industries. In some industries it's worse. In some channels it's worse. If they're using traditional web-based password reset processes, it's actually 1 in 4 can be attempted fraud. 1% of all logons to a service are actually unauthorized access. It's not the actual end user who's accessing their service. So how do we look at kind of validating who is accessing the self-service portal and who is not, and why that is a risk? And that is a risk because of the developing nature of the marketplace and fraud that we have, and the big fraud problem, which is the growth of scams. We're seeing, and I hate the term scams because it's a catch-all for lots of different issues, but we hear about that in terms of APP, authorized push payment fraud, banking impersonation, tax authority impersonation. There's crypto investment scams. There's romance and butchering scams, where they target a victim and then take them for every slice that they can, every different cut and revenue that they can from an operator. Now, the issue with scams is the growth of scams, but only 7% of scams are actually reported by the end users because of the shame in relation to they've been convinced to give somebody in Nigeria 20,000 euros via a romance scam or utilizing of deepfakes and AI interactions. So all scams are not even actually reported. And the magical AI word, it's good for us, but again, it's good for the criminal element as well, particularly the generative AI, so able to manipulate videos, manipulate imagery, create conversational text between users. We use it for our self-service and customer service chatbots. The fraudsters use it for their target interaction and manipulation of the end users. So what we need to do is shift our approach to how we look at fraud. Because what we've tended to look at is this: when they make a payment in the banking space, when they purchase in the e-commerce space. What we don't tend to look at is the rest of the journey. That onboarding, we tend to focus on a KYC, what do I need to do, regulatory perspective, rather than do I actually understand who the customer is and are they actually valid? And again, managing their account, accessing their own information. It means, if I can give access to somebody, if I can gain access to that information, that's information I can build and gather for a scam. So for example, self-service for your telecoms account. You might be able to go and see your telecoms bill, your mobile bill. Of course, if I, as a fraudster, can get hold of that, I can go and see your mobile bill. I can see when it was paid, how much it was. I may even be able to see some of the account details of the account. So, of course, if I'm going to do an impersonation scam and target an individual, I don't target his bank account. I target his telecoms account, gather that information, manipulate the end user, reach out to them and say, I'm your bank. I can tell you paid your telecoms bill on the 23rd, and it came from account ending 1234, and it was 28.54 euros. I can do that and gather more and more information from other self-service sites about you as an individual, and that facilitates my scam. So do we understand who's accessing the accounts, how it's been processed? And then, of course, in the banking space and the financial space, where the money goes to. So there's an aspect of setting up mule accounts or manipulating people to host a mule account. Accounts that I can move money through in a simple factor. So we need to look across the space. But of course, as mentioned, we need to look across that whole journey in a perspective of, do we have a 360-degree view of the customer? And can we do that in a non-intrusive way that is actually facilitates the user experience rather than inhibits the user experience? So what we need to look at is different things. And we see different types of technology that are out there now that can be utilized. And I'm going to go through quickly, because of the time limits, quickly through some of these kind of technologies that are there and how they can be utilized, and give you an example of an actual live utilization of these technologies. And I'll start with digital identity. And this is where I kind of say this is not governmental digital identity. This is not my passport in a digital form or an ID card in a digital form. This is how I, as a user, interact with the digital services. So what devices do I use? What is the makeup of that device? So look at different detection points. What type of device is it? What OS is it running? What language is it in? What time zone is it in? What's the screen resolution? Where is my location, my IP location, my GPS location, etc.? Build up a data profile. But of course, I don't just use this device. I use this device. I use a laptop. I use a home PC. So me as a digital user, when we're talking about digital identity, it's all those digital touch points that an end user may have. And you can utilize that from can I recognize a good customer, and can I look for a bad customer? And doing that perspective, using digital identity in that way, gives us a better view of what is going on. So we build all different aspects of the identity, and then links between identities, i.e. I have a shared device at home that the family use, my son uses, my daughter uses. They have their own digital persona, but it's linked to the same device in the same location. They access different services, but it has a profile of how it behaves. So what we can utilize digital identity is a look at, can we identify good versus bad? And if I take a picture from one of our customers in terms of how they do that, we look at a good account perspective. Well, how many devices do I have? Now, it is over one, because most of us have more than one device. But I predominantly use one. So on my banking app, I'm 99% on my phone. Occasionally, I use the web at home on my laptop. So it's kind of average of one devices. How often do I update or change my details, or how often does a percentage of my customer base update their details? Well, that's not a regular occurrence, but it does happen. New email address, new phone number, roaming SIM that's associated with it, an eSIM, etc. All these kind of different details and connections. How often do I use it from multiple different geographies? Well, for me, as a regular traveler, actually, I'm using it from different geographies all the time. So I'm part of that 4% for this customer, but the majority of their customers are in their location, in their environment, and static. How many times do I access a service? Depends on the type of service. For my banking app, maybe once a day. For my life insurance, once a year. So I have a different kind of profile of how I interact. And then, other things, do I do that on a call? So an active call perspective. Then we look at, can I do that as a fraud perspective as well? Fraudulent, lots of different devices, lots of different locations. Active calls are going on because I'm a fraudster manipulating somebody, so I'm involved in a scam. There's a different profile. So just using digital identity can tell me who is good, who is bad. For my customer experience, I can treat my customers, good customers, recognize customers better, and of course I can highlight the bad. And what I call it is a 99% and 1%. That is your perspective. You're really what you wanted to identify, the 99%, so you can manage the 1% effectively. If I look at other things, behavioral biometrics. Now, we know biometrics in terms of face biometrics, voice biometrics. Behavioral biometrics is how I hold my device, how I type, how I swipe, how I point, how I click, and how I interact generically as a user. So you can look at different aspects of how quickly do I navigate on a page. Do I swipe left all the time or swipe right? I don't know which the right one is on particular apps. But I may be looking at how I use my mouse, and how I interact. And so we look at these different perspectives as well to kind of go, okay, is this an end user? And is it that concurrently, that same end user? Or is it somebody purporting to be that end user who has their details, who has their username, who has their password, and is copy and pasting those details in to a page? So let me take an example here, just because it's, a picture tells 1,000 words. One of our customers does credit cards. You can go and choose your own credit card image and select it as a customer. So what does a regular customer do? Looks at several different images and decides which one they're going to use. When we look at the fraud profile, the fraudsters don't look at any. They go, whatever is a set, bring a page, bang, straight through the application. It's the same on devices, stealing a device. I'm going to target the iPhone 17 Pro Max 2 terabyte because that's the most valuable product. I'm not going to go for a lowly, cheap Android as a product. It's how I navigate that page, how I interact, and how I manipulate the process. And you can detect this utilizing behavioral biometrics. Other side of that is kind of simple things, and I'll just kind of quickly click through, is simple things. Copy and pasting. Am I going off the page and on the page and copying details in to an interaction? Do I use autofill? Are my passwords saved in my interaction? Do I use those all the time? And each of those has different risk profiles. So if I'm copy and pasting for this customer, it had a 40 times increase in risk just by using copy and paste on certain fields. Now it might be, email field, phone number field. How often do you have to copy and paste your phone number into a web page? You know your own phone number. It's other people's numbers you've forgotten because they're all in your contacts file now on your phone. Yeah. Things like entering your username really, really quickly. Here's one example where we see kind of bots being utilized to try and do a login, a new sign-up form. So this is an account opening form online. Genuine user goes through the fields, their mouse goes over the page, and if your mouse is anything like my mouse at home, it's not smooth and concurrent. You're fighting with it all the time to get it where you want on the page. Yeah. If you're using a touchpad, probably quite similar. It goes too far, you come back, go through. There's that kind of random interaction. The fraudsters program their bots to try and simulate that interaction to enter the details into the page. And what we see is these lovely curves, these lovely perfect movement, perfect timing across the page, perfect movement between two fields, a Bezier curve as they call it. This is an identifier where actually that interaction is not a human because it's too perfect. A human doesn't operate in that manner. So again, you're using behavioral biometrics to identify different interactions. And you're looking for the anomalous. What is true, what is consistent versus the anomalies, and those kind of things. AI modeling, going to go quickly through this, but we all want to use AI and those capabilities. Data points like this are thousands and thousands of data points. So we want to pull out what is good, what is bad, and this is where we can use positive AI, machine learning models, programming models to actually highlight these kind of issues and then define them per type of issue we want to deal with. So is it dealing with scams? Is it dealing with money mules? There's different kind of perspectives that we can bring up. Secure customer authentication and kind of validation as we go forward. Let's use those models effectively to identify those data points that we just captured. The digital identity, the behavioral biometric profiling, thousands of data points. This is where the machines can help us build those into appropriate models for our risk points across that journey. And then we go to talking about kind of ID and ID verification. So utilizing kind of digital ID verification in a digital journey, digital onboarding, that's good, it's effective. But we need the capabilities to pull out the information about what we're doing on not only, is the data correct and does the face image, but is it a live person? Is it being manipulated? Are there kind of live transitions between there? Can we do the live check, the selfie check? Can we do the depth perception? Can we look at the analysis in terms of, if I'm taking an image of my own document, that is not a static thing. I am minutely shaking and picking up on that movement. There's a reflection and lighting and conditioning. Again, what we look to do is, can you tie these things together? So you say, is it the digital identity using that device? Are they kind of then interacting correctly with the behavioral biometrics? And then the image is actually aligned and correct in terms of not only matching, but in terms of the analytics of bringing that forward. And of course, what's that mean? That means efficiency savings, bringing those things together. You're doing that because, again, we've got to do this in an effective way. We want to do that where we don't interfere with the customer journey. I don't want to do an IDV check on every single customer, particularly if 1 in 10 is fraudulent. If 1 in 10 is fraudulent, I don't want to be doing expensive further analysis and further checks, particularly third-party checks, on things that are not going to generate any revenue. So we need to bring these things together. So it's a quick 15-minute overview of things we can do, data we can utilize, tools that are out there that we build in this journey, but are actually frictionless, because all these things happen in the background. The customer doesn't have to kind of validate anything, doesn't have to interact with anything until they get to an ID check and that kind of point. The digital device, that's how they're going to access your service. The behavioral biometrics, you need to know what language they're using, what size is their screen, where are they pressing on the screen, because you need to know to allow them to click next and go on. So these are, pieces of information that you capture in a web interaction, in an app interaction. We just start to utilize that information in a different way to make a better customer experience. And, what we need to do, though, is do that across the whole journey. So it's not just an onboarding thing. It's not just, when I make a payment thing. It's about every stage. Can I kind of profile that user across my whole onboarding journey, across my whole interaction journey, and their kind of payment and growth journey to bring us understand who is trusted, who is not, in terms of customer interaction. So with that, I know I have 15 minutes. I'm going to sit down and start our discussion when my host comes back in. You told me to be on time.
Yes, yes, you were, and thank you very, very much. So, we hope that the audience liked what you had to tell us. I wanted to hear, can you go a bit deeper into why is it important for organizations to change their fraud approach to include a greater view and understanding of their customers? What are, in that sense, what are the challenges or changes that need to be adapted?
Yeah, so the biggest dynamic I've seen, and I probably shouldn't say this, I'm now 30 years in fraud. That's why the grey hair, and I should say in fraud prevention.
Yes, maybe add that just for people.
But the biggest change really over the last, should we say, 4 to 5 years has been the target of the fraud attacks. Mm-hmm. So as I say, when I started, it was about protecting your network, it was protecting your infrastructure, how payments were processed, how transactions were processed. Now the fraudsters, the criminals that are out there, and they're organized and very, very organized, are targeting the weakest link, our end consumer. So they are targeting the end consumer, manipulating the end consumer. So if you don't understand who your end consumer is and how they interact with you, that is kind of creating that level of risk, which is what they're taking advantage of. Particularly, as I say, the scams are the kind of prevalent things, but there's a huge growth at the moment in something we call first-party fraud or friendly fraud, which is actually where it is the end user who's doing the action, but then they're being persuaded or paid to do the fraud, thinking that if I order something online and say to the organization, that wasn't me, I didn't do that. They've already sold the device or sold the thing to somebody else, but they're saying it's not them. And it's down to the organization to try and validate, no, it actually was you doing that interaction. And if you're not kind of tracking and understanding and tracing that, it's hard for you to identify those types of risks. And again, this is where scams kind of come in, because if I persuade you to send me some money, or I'm the tax authority, you are the end customer doing the action. So your username and password are correct, your details are correct, you can validate your own ID, but actually it's the interaction that's actually you're being manipulated to do that. And that's one of the biggest shift of changes of how it's happening, and therefore we need to shift how we approach, how we defend that issue.
Is this happening? Is the change in the approach happening? And also, if it is it happening fast and well enough?
It is happening, but I would say it's happening slowly and at different speeds across different industries. Obviously, we're representing the whole kind of fintech industry kind of here. Some industries are kind of trying to move ahead and adapt that. Others are still very much traditional kind of view because, again, I spoke about accessing people's accounts and accessing their data. That may not cost me any revenue if people are accessing my data, my customers' data, because unless they're committing the fraud on that account, I may not lose. But from a scam point of view, that's where they're gathering that data, so they're kind of influencing the situation. And we see now with regulation changing and liability shifts changing, where I'll take Singapore as an example of where for scams now it's not only the banks that are liable for the losses, but the telco organizations involved in the scams are also being made liable for losses. So regulators are looking at kind of how that is addressed as well.
And in terms of this developing fraud landscape, how does this impact our region, and why is it necessary for service providers to have a wider global view, to have this on their mind all the time?
I would say there's two aspects kind of here. One, as we've just heard, we're kind of developing these services now from the ground up. We're building this kind of digital transformation. It's the ideal time to put in that kind of fraud framework and controls and mechanism. So as we grow in this region and build those services, now's the time, rather than thinking about it in 2 or 3 years once the problem's been realized. So that's kind of one aspect of kind of taking, grasping the nettle, as it were, and seizing the day to address the risk. In terms of the global view, it's addressing that risk in the right way. We can be very siloed in our approach. So banks will say, what's happening in my banking industry, in my environment, and they will look at that data. And telecoms do the same, and e-commerce will do the same, and look at it from a what's happened in Montenegro perspective or the Balkans perspective. Whereas actually, I can probably confidently say 99% of the attacks that are happening in the digital space are not happening in your region. They're coming from elsewhere. They're running scam operations elsewhere and attacking your region. And they are cross-industry attacks. They're gathering data from multiple points. They're manipulating the process at multiple points. So, and again, one of the romance scams are now, there's this thing called, and it's a horrible term, pig butchering, that is out there for romance scams. Basically, what it's referring to is if I'm a farmer and I have a pig, I take multiple cuts of meat that I can sell in different ways. As a fraudster, if I find you as a victim, there are multiple different things I can do against you. I can take money out, in a romance scam, but then I can compromise your accounts and order goods in your name. I can then do something else with your details or sell your details onto other parties to do that with. So it's that growth, and that attack happens across the multiple industries. So if you're only looking at one element, i.e. the banking element and payment going out, you don't have the full picture of interaction and capability. And if you're looking at only kind of Montenegro transactions or interactions, again, the fraud threat is a lot wider and more global.
Let's stay on this just for another second. In your experience, so in the EMEA region, who got this right? Who understood that you need to have a cross-industry approach, and you cannot tackle this by yourself?
Yeah, so it started to grow. So we kind of help and facilitate some of our customers do what we call a consortium methodology. So where they actually share data real time on the digital personas that are being utilized, on the details that are being manipulated. That started in one industry. If I take an example in Switzerland at the moment, we have telecoms, we have a BNPL, buy now, pay later provider, and a kind of postal and kind of postal service, all providing into that environment, as well as the banking spaces as well. So this is where we've got multiple industries contributing together to share real-time information on fraud, threats, and issues. And the ideal scenario is to get that to kind of obviously not only a kind of localized level, but obviously regional level and kind of global level of working together and getting the regulators to allow us to do that as well. We have to work with regulators to say,
it's an important angle.
Look, this is a benefit not only to the organizations who are financially compromised, but this is protecting the end consumer, because the end consumer are the targets, and the only way you can protect them is by working together and being able to share and utilize the data that is out there.
Okay, thank you for clarifying this. You also talked about the several different stages of the customer journey and tools that can be used. What are the benefits of using these types of approach, and should it be done in combination?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I would kind of frame it in terms of, do you know who's accessing your service? So if somebody downloads my app, lands on my web page, utilizing things like I mentioned, digital persona, I can immediately say, well, is that a trusted entity? I.e., did that consumer wake up this morning, grab their phone and go on their banking app? Did they then go on to Netflix and watch TV? Did they then go and buy a train ticket? What interactions have they done so far during the day before they come and interact with me? So can I kind of start to classify that as partially trusted or not, just as a profile, never mind any personal details or anything associated with it. From that perspective, then I can look at, there are obviously bad patterns out there, i.e. this person has opened 20 different accounts in the past 2 hours with 20 different providers, or purported to be 20 different people to one provider. You can identify those things straight away and say, right, well, do I even allow them to go through this process? If I start to allow them to go through this process, okay, let's take the next piece of validation. Is the data they are entering in the process, are they copy and pasting that data in? Are they is it valid data? Are they entering it in a way that we would expect it to be entered? Or is it, again, a fraudster in operation? So it's kind of breaking down each step of the interaction. Now, that's good from a fraud perspective, but it's actually even better from a customer digital experience perspective.
Why?
Because what we tend to do is we tend to use, the basics are kind of, not the bank, an OTP, a one-time password or a two-factor authentication. As, do I know who you are? No, I'm going to send you a two-factor authentication, or I'm going to ask you to validate, and I'm going to ask you to validate. That becomes a painful customer experience. So if you can digitally recognize a user as they land and interact on your web page, hopefully 99% of the time, 80% of the time, you can say, no, that is a trusted customer. We can let them continue their interaction without an intervention. So therefore, it's kind of frictionless, that lovely word, to the end user. And you only apply then risk-appropriate friction where you need to in the journey, which is good for the customer experience. And that means, again, you're kind of you're building your system for the 99%, and you easily identify the 1% that are different, 1% you don't want to deal with. That has another knock-on effect of operational savings. Because if somebody lands on my webpage, if I have third-party checks that I must do by regulatory mandate, I must check a third-party, a credit check, for example, in some markets, or an ID check or a validation check. Well, I don't do that for a fraudulent customer. So therefore, I immediately save on that cost operationally. I'm more effective in what I focus on in terms of the user experience. So there's multiple impacts of why you should build it from the ground up in terms of the multiple different data points you should look at in analyzing that kind of process.
Is this approach prone to change as the attacks and the sophistication of the attacks evolves?
In terms of, it may change in terms of the kind of anomalies you're looking for and the methodologies you utilize. But I think a core thing from when we're talking about digital fintech and digital services is, can you validate and authenticate who you're dealing with is who you want to be dealing with? Is it, is it a valid subscriber? Is it a human or not? Is it a valid subscriber, valid user? Are they, is it actually them that's doing the action? Can you validate it is actually them doing the interaction? And if so, well, fast track them through the experience. Don't put in unnecessary steps. Again, my telecoms company is terrible for this. If I use an example, is I've moved house recently. I went to my wife's phone, picked up her phone, went to upgrade her phone because the latest Apple is out there. Going through the process, I'm on her phone doing the interaction. I realise, I have to go through an OTP to log in. Mm-hmm. Then I realise the address is wrong, so I have to update the address, which requires another authentication. Then I get through that process. Then I want to order the handset. I then go through another interaction and another authentication. Then they actually ring me from their call center and say,
is everything okay?
Is everything okay? Can we validate the transaction? That call center was in India, so I'm speaking to somebody out of region, kind of saying, and then asked me for my username and password. It's like, this is not a process I should be going through. Whereas if I had identified I'm on the phone, I'm interacting, my behavioral biometrics stack up, I'm doing one consistent interaction, I don't need 5 different step-ups during that journey. That's a bad customer experience. I mean, in the end, I just cancelled the experience and actually went to the Apple store and bought a phone instead. So
it's a direct result.
Yeah, there's a direct impact to the consumer's journey in that process.
Well, Mr. Lane Sellers, thank you for a very substantial, quick fireside chat. I think we covered quite a lot. And I would like our audience to give a round of applause to Mr. Lane Sellers.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.